So, who exactly are the three Antichrists and how are we going to build the unified concept from the three Antichrists? We will do this by comparing the three views, and then based on this comparison we can build the unified concept. So, what exactly are three views? Well, the three views are the Jewish view, the Christian view, and finally the Islamic view, and as you might be aware, the Antichrist appears in each of these views. Before we can simplify things, we need to address complexity, and this comes from comparing how the concept of the Antichrist is dealt with in each of the views. Now, in each of the views, there is some concept of the Antichrist as well as the Messiah. However, the roles, the characters, the alliances, and finally the characteristics change across the views, due to which sometimes the description of the Antichrist in one view is strikingly similar to the description of the Messiah in another view, and all this adds to the complexity, but it also helps us simplify things, as we shall see in detail later. At the outset, it is important to clarify that the Jewish Messiah is the principal character in the Jewish view, whereas the characters of the Antichrist as well as the prophet are loosely defined or toned down. The Jewish Messiah rises from amongst the people and is basically a political leader, essentially a king, and he is not attributed extraordinary supernatural powers. The coming of the Jewish Messiah is associated with specific events which are as follows. A. Rebuilding of the Temple in Jerusalem. B. Ingathering of the Jewish exiles. C. Ushering in an era of global peace. It is important to note that in the Jewish view, while part of the concept of the Antichrist come from the same sources, that is the Old Testament prophets like Isaiah, Ezekiel and Daniel, but the Antichrist is a term loosely applied to anyone who opposes the Jewish Messiah, persecutes the Jews, or desecrates their temple. This is based on the prototype of the Antichrist described by the prophet Daniel in reference to the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes, who desecrated the temple and persecuted the Jews. Similar to the concept of the Antichrist in the Jewish view, the concept of the prophet or the false prophet is also loosely defined as the spiritual forces that ally with the forces of Jewish Antichrist against the Jewish Messiah and the Jews. We will now define a glossary of terms that we need to build this unified concept. A. Role. The common framework across the views provides us with a list of all the roles that are used in each of the views. B. Character. Each role is occupied by somebody, and that somebody is the character. In some cases, we have a revelation about the character occupying the role, but in several cases the character is only loosely defined. C. Alliance. Alliances change across the views. For example, the prophet in a view may ally with Antichrist against the Messiah in that view, or may ally with the Messiah against the Antichrist of that view, as we shall see. D. Characteristic. This simply refers to the fact as to whether the role or character represents the forces of good or the forces of evil. Now let us look at the steps we will follow as we generate our unified concept of the end times. A. Glossary of terms used. B. Role of the most overlapping character across the views. C. High degree of concordance between the views. D. Original versus copies, not a forgery but a deception. E. Common framework across the views. F. Shifting of roles, alliances and characteristics across the views. G. Conclusion. Role of the most overlapping character across the views. As most of you may already be aware, Jesus is the most overlapping character across the views. For Christians, especially born-again believers, there is no doubt that Jesus Christ is the Messiah in the Christian view. Amongst Jews, there is only a small group called as Messianic Jews who recognize Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, while a large majority of Jews do not recognize Jesus as the Messiah, as the three specific events associated with the arrival of the Jewish Messiah were not fulfilled in his time or thereafter. In the Islamic view, Jesus is the prophet and his role is to help the Islamic Messiah, referred to as the Mahdi, to defeat the Islamic Antichrist who is called as the Dajjal. So interestingly, a comparison across the views indicates that Jesus has widely differing roles in different views, from the Messiah in the Christian view to the prophet in the Islamic view to no specific role in the Jewish view. There is remarkable concordance between the details of the Mahdi, that is the Islamic Messiah, as described in the Islamic scriptures, and the Christian or Judeo-Christian Antichrist, as described in the Judeo-Christian scriptures, which we shall look at in details in our future videos. For now, let us look at some of main points of concordance. He will come riding a white horse. Exalts himself above all and magnifies himself. Establishes the final caliphate, an everlasting world-dominating kingdom of Islam. He will have a large army which will go from nation to nation to punish the unbelievers. He will march to Jerusalem and slaughter the Jews and establish rule on the Temple Mount. He will bring rain, wind, crops, wealth and happiness, and all will love him. He will make a peace agreement with the Jews and West for a period of 7 years, and in these 7 years, he will establish the kingdom of Islam in this world. Original versus copy, deception, not a forgery. So we ask the obvious question from the earlier discussion about the role of the most overlapping character across the views: how can the same Jesus have so much different roles across the views? In the Christian view, Jesus is the Christ or the Christian Messiah, while in the Islamic view, Jesus is a prophet who gives all his power to the Islamic Messiah the Mahdi to defeat the Islamic Antichrist the Dajjal. For a small minority of Jews, that is the Messianic Jews, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, while for a large majority of them Jesus has no role in the end-time prophecies. How is this possible? We will shortly answer this question, but before we can do that we also need to address another point we have discussed earlier. How can there be such a high degree of concordance between the Antichrist in one view, Christian or Judeo-Christian view, and the Islamic Messiah the Mahdi? Is it possible that this is purely coincidence? Before we try to answer both of these questions, it is important to clarify that this video does not endorse any particular view, as that we leave it up to the individual convictions. However, only for the purpose of building our unified concept, it may not be necessary to answer that question. With this backdrop, we note that possibly the only way in which we can answer both the questions that we raised earlier is by realizing that one view is the true and correct view and the other view is a deception. Note that we are not saying that it is a forgery, but that it is a deception. A forgery endeavors to be as close to the original from which it was copied, which is definitely not the case here, but a deception is defined as an act or statement which misleads, hides the truth, or promotes a belief or concept or an idea that is not true. This understanding is the only way in which we can satisfactorily provide answers to both the questions that we posed earlier. So, essentially, one view, we are not saying which one, is the true view, and another view is prepared after fully understanding the true and original view and then tweaking it to mislead or hide the truth, that is essentially to deceive. Now that we have established that one view is original and true and another is a deception, let us start to build the unified concept across the views by first establishing the common framework. For ease of understanding, we will avoid using the terms Antichrist, Beast, Messiah till we have completely built the framework across the views, and then we can look at the differences and similarities between the views. Consider the common framework shown, which is present in all the three views, and as we have agreed, we have avoided any use of terms like Antichrist, Beast, Messiah, etc., but we have simplified it using the basic terms. First of all, we will define the primary roles across the views. The Redeemer shown in green always represents the forces of good in that view. The spiritual leader shown in blue represents the spiritual, prophetic powers, and these can be either good or evil, as we shall see later. The political or military leader shown in red represents the leadership akin to a king, and again this can also be for good or evil, again as we shall see later. However, only the primary roles do not enable us to properly depict all the views, and hence we define some secondary roles as shown. These are copies of the political/military leadership and also the spiritual/prophetic leader, but are external, that is separate from the primary roles, and to differentiate from the primary roles these are shaped differently. As we have looked earlier, there is an original view and also there is a deception. To fully understand the deception, we need to understand what tweaks have been brought in to form the deception. A study of the three views reveals that on our common framework that we established earlier, the following things change across the views. A. The arrangement of roles in a view. B. The characters occupying the roles in a view. C. Alliances between the different roles in a view. D. Characteristics of a role in a view that is good or evil. Based on this understanding, let us now build the representation for each of the views. As shown, it is important to understand the convention that will be used across the views. A green circle with a positive sign in it indicates that the role represents forces of good, while a red circle with a negative sign in it indicates that the role represents the forces of evil. Also, a red line with arrowheads set against each other represents a feud between the roles that this line connects, while a green line with the arrowheads turned away from each other represents an alliance between the roles that the lines connect. Consider the Jewish view that is being depicted. As seen, the Jewish view is slightly different from others because, as we noted earlier, the Jewish Messiah is a central character and hence occupies all the primary roles, that is, he is a political leader as well as a spiritual leader, that is, a prophet, and also the Redeemer of the Jews. As shown, the external political or military forces which oppose the Jewish Messiah represent the forces of the Antichrist, and the external spiritual forces which ally with the Antichrist to wage a war against the Jewish Messiah and the Jews represent the forces of the false prophet. Both of these forces, that is, forces of the Antichrist as well as forces of the false prophet, represent evil in this view. Now let us look at the Christian view of the end times. In this view, we have clarity about the fact that Jesus Christ is the Messiah or the Redeemer, which denotes the forces of good. In this view, the military of political leader, that is, the Antichrist, will ally with the spiritual leader, that is, the false prophet, and both of these represent the forces of the evil and they feud against the Messiah or Redeemer, that is Jesus Christ. Finally, let us look at the Islamic view of the end times. Prima facie, this looks very much like the Christian view, but you must note the differences between the Christian view as well as the Islamic view very carefully. The most obvious difference is that Jesus occupies different roles across these views, that is, the Messiah in the Christian view and the prophet in the Islamic view. Another important fact is that the prophet in the Islamic view is a positive character that is allies with the Islamic Messiah to fight the Islamic Antichrist, and so it sides with the forces of good in that view. It is noteworthy that in between the Christian view and the Islamic view, the characteristic that is positive, negative, or good, evil of the spiritual leader changes. In the Islamic view, the spiritual leader sides with the Islamic Messiah, the Mahdi, against the Islamic Antichrist, the Dajjal, and so it is not a false prophet in that view since it sides with the forces of good in that view. However, in the Christian view, the spiritual leader sides with the Christian Antichrist against the Christian Messiah, that is Jesus Christ, and so in this view, it is a false prophet since it sides with the forces of evil in this view. So, we have used a common framework, common glossary of terms, the same conventions to build the depiction of the end times for each of the views, that is Jewish, Christian and Islamic view. Thus, this represents our unified concept of the end times. Since we are basing this on a common framework, using the same glossary of terms and the same display conventions, we can readily compare the end-time depictions across the view and understand the similarities as well as the differences. In our future videos, we will build further on our unified concept to understand more about the end times.